Father, thank you for this day, and thank you for bringing us together to worship and fellowship. Thank you for this class and the programs and opportunities we have to serve you through this church. Be with us during our time together and with the lesson that Russell brings us, and just thank you for the preparation he puts into this each and every week, and ask that you bless our time together. In your name, amen.
Good morning. Jeff did this slide, which is the stained glass that is in our chapel that Carolyn and I help sponsor, and they're actually much prettier on the slide. And so he sent that, and I hadn't necessarily paid that much attention until this week, and I looked at it, and it's moving. We are still waiting on 3, and we're in prayer that the guy doesn't die before he finishes the next 3. But eventually you'll be able to walk around with your grandkids and tell the story of Christ. You might say a little prayer for me. This is going to be another one where I tear up all the way through the lesson. The story of the crucifixion is meaningful to me. And so I fought through. I hopefully will do better than I did last week, but there'll be a few tears because this is a tough story, and it should mean a lot to all of us. And I am deeply convinced that it's a true story that's meaningful and effectual for our salvation. So pay attention. Let's go to the time clock. So I covered this last week, and I think Catherine and several others said that it was confusing. So I'm going to confuse you again, but I want you to understand the timing of the crucifixion and what's going on. The traditional belief is that Passover was on Thursday, and that crucifixion happened on Friday. Saturday he was in the grave, and that he arose on Sunday. It's important to note that the Jewish time clock their day begins at 6 p.m. So our clock at the top, you wouldn't see 6 p.m., you would see 12 a.m. So at sundown, their new day begins. So on Thursday, on Passover, they're supposed to have the Passover meal. They're supposed to have the lamb that has been sacrificed. And so 256,000 lambs were sacrificed on this Passover that Jesus died. So Thursday before sundown, right before sundown, while it's still on Nisan the 14th, which is the Hebrew holiday for Passover, on that day they have this lamb that has been prepared, and they begin their Passover Seder, and that will last into the night. And so as they get past 6 p.m., the Jews didn't count hours. They counted watches in accordance with the Romans. And so you see the first watch, you see the second watch. The third watch is the crow watch, which is relevant today as we talk about Peter denying Jesus. So what this tells you is that he began a Last Supper before sundown, and he's gone all night. And he's going to go through 6 trials, which I'll walk you through. 6 trials that are kangaroo courts. I learned in the last session that most people don't know what a kangaroo court is. I'll explain what that is. But the timing, when they began to count hours, was actually at 6 a.m. So they began to count hours. The Jews began, like I'm Jewish, they begin to count hours at 6 a.m. So they would say the first hour of the day. So at 6 a.m., 6 a.m. is the first hour of the day. On the third hour of the day of Friday following Passover, Nisan the 15th, Jesus is hung on the cross. And then 6 hours later, he dies. Midway through at 12 noon to us, midway through that day, the sun goes dark. And so I just want you to understand all of this timing. This Last Supper that is occurring, Jesus is telling his disciples, this is my body, the bread, this is representative of my body, take and eat. It represents me turning myself over for you. And then he holds over the cup and he says, this is the cup, that's my blood that will be poured out for you. And these disciples are looking around at the seating area. And they had the traditional, as I explained last week, triclinium three-part table. And they see John sitting to Jesus' right. And we know that because he laid his head back. It's a place of prominence. And he's close enough to touch Judas, another place of prominence. And they begin to have a discussion about who is going to be the greatest. And for Simon Peter must have said something. He must have been bragging. Something must have been going on, because he said something and Jesus looks right at him and says, Simon, Simon, Satan demanded to have you. And when he said you, it's all y'all, it's plural. Satan demanded to have you so that he could sift you like wheat, so that he could shake the good out of you. But I have prayed for you. I prayed that you will not lose your faith. I've prayed that when you turn back to me, saying you're going to turn away, when you turn back to me, you'll be in a position to strengthen and prop up your brothers. And Simon says, I would die for you. I'd go to prison for you. And he says, before that cock crows, that cock will crow at 3 a.m. He says, before that cock crows at 3 a.m., you will deny me 3 times. The cock would have crowed at 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. I said there were 6 trials that took place. And one of those trials is going on in the third watch. And it's a trial that is before the high priest. So with that, Sean, let's kick off.
While he was still speaking, there came a crowd, and the man called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He drew near to Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus said to him, Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? And when those who were around him saw what would follow, they said, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? And one of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus said, no more of this. And he touched his ear and healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests and officers of the temple and elders who had come out against him, have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs? When I was with you day after day in the temple, you did not lay hands on me, but this is your hour in the power of darkness.
While he was still speaking, where he is in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he has just finished praying. And this is where I choked up last time, right at the exact same place. He is praying that this cup, which Spurgeon said was pure distilled evil, would pass from him, and that he knows that God is going to look away, and he's just finished praying that prayer, and he says, "But not my will, but your will." And he comes and he finds Peter and John, who he's asked to pray. And he's telling them, you need to pray for your own strength so that you can get through all of this. And they're not praying. They're not prepared. And so while he's still talking to Peter and John, while he's still saying, you need to be praying, this crowd comes up. And all of the synoptic gospels put this instance, his arrest, right at the same time as him approaching these disciples about the prayer. And it says, and there came a man, one of the 12. They always describe him as one of the 12, but he Luke says the man called Judas, and he's putting distance between him with that language and the rest of the disciples, and he drew near to him to kiss him. And this was such hypocrisy. To kiss him was not merely a sign. This culture, to kiss, a holy kiss, to greet, was the ultimate sign of friendship and welcoming. And he had developed this sign basically to crucify him. Now, they needed a sign. As we get into this, you're going to find out that this is not a small group of people. This is more than likely hundreds of people that are coming up. These are Romans, these are politicians, these are officers of the court. Something in the middle of the night has got them riled, and it is that this would be a Messiah. I am going to wear you out today, because when you go through the story of the crucifixion, it's important that you gather the view of the other synoptic gospel writers. And I would have had 50 slides had I put everything that I'm going to read, but I'm going to wear you out. The first, when we talk about the kiss and that it was going to be a symbol, we go to Matthew 26, 47 through 48. While he was still speaking, this is Christ, again, still speaking, talking to the disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a great crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests. The chief priests are not the high priest. These are elevated priests. The high priest will come into the story later. Now the betrayer, Judas, had given them a sign saying, "The one that I kiss is the man, seize him." They needed a sign because the Romans, they didn't know. They're not sitting there in the temple these 4 days prior to this. They're not sitting there listening. And these hundreds of people wouldn't have known. They needed a symbol so that everyone knew. It also would have been dark. There would have been, not much light. They're coming up with torches. And so they needed this symbol, although that it was hypocritical, so that they could execute. And Jesus said to him in verse 48, "Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with the kiss?" Jesus calls himself, people will say, well, he never called himself the Son of God. He's going to call himself the Son of God today. But he called himself Son of Man, and it comes from Daniel 7, the prophecy. If you remember, Daniel 7 talked about a Son of Man that would approach the Ancient of Days, which is a word for God, and sit at his right hand. Jesus referred to himself 82 times as the Son of Man. It's a sign that he was the Son of God. It's also the sign that he is human, that he is both God-man. And when those that were around him saw what would follow on, they said, "Lord, shall we strike with the sword?" And one of them struck the servant. Who was that? Peter. So let's go to John 18, which is also not in the slides. So Judas, having procured a band of soldiers, some versions say a cohort, and a cohort would have been up to 600 soldiers. So there are some people that believe there's actually 600 people that are coming across the Kidron Valley from the temple, from the Antonia fortress, crossing over into the Garden of Gethsemane, along with some officers of the chief priests. They had their own police force, the Jews did, and the Pharisees, and there were with lanterns and torches. Then Jesus, knowing all that would happen, came forward and said to them, "Who do you seek?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." And Jesus said, "I am he." And the actual words are, "I am." Again, "I am" is what? In Hebrew, "I am" is the tetragrammaton, Yahweh. So, tetragrammaton? You could just say Yahweh. By now, you need to learn tetragrammaton. If you're going to sit in the front row, Missy, you learn tetragrammaton. When Jesus said to him, "I am," you got me all flustered. They answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth," and Jesus said to them, "I am." Judas, who betrayed him, was standing there with him, and Jesus said to them, "I am." And they drew back, and they fell to the ground. So he asked them again, "Who do you seek?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." And Jesus said, "I told you, I am he. So if you seek me, let these men go." this was to fulfill the word that had been spoken, of those who you gave me, I have not lost one. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, and that is a small sword in Greek. I don't remember the name, but it's like mashera. And so it's a small curved sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. And so Jesus said to Peter, put your sword back in its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me? I personally believe that this was a failed kill shot, that Peter was not a skilled soldier, and I think he was trying to lop his head off and only got his ear. And I may be wrong, but I think he just missed. And we go back to last week's lesson, and Jesus is saying, now it's time. No more. You need to pack your money bags. You need to pack your knapsack. You need to have everything ready. You need to have swords. And what he's saying is the world changes this week. Everything changes this week. No longer are you're from now on, you're persona non grata. From now on, you are going to be looked down on. And they said, we have two swords. And the words were, it is enough. And there's questions about what that means. And I told you last week, I believe he's saying enough talk about swords. And it's because of this. Because he said, put this away. I'm supposed to drink this cup. This cup that is pure, distilled evil is what I have to drink for you. And so I got to do that with her. Was that amazing? All right. How about a little spontaneous applause? Thank you. Thank you. To our guest, I work for applause. Not from guests. We take money from guests. Okay, so he struck him, and Jesus said, no more of this, verse 51. And he touched the ear. This is the only healing we have of Jesus where he is actually fixing a wound from somebody that was in battle, if you will. And it's his last miracle, other than the big one, which is raising himself from the dead. And so, no more of this. He touched the ear, healed it, and then said to the chief priest and officers of the temple and elders who had come out against him, I love this, have you come out to me as a robber with swords and clubs? And what he's saying is, it's 2 a.m., it's 1 a.m. We're in the middle of the dark. I've got nothing. I've got two numbskulls that have two swords that can't even use it. I was in your temple, right where the Antonia fortress was, every day this week. I was teaching right there, and you come out like this? I thought this is just perfect. You can just see him. Have you come out like I'm a robber? And he says down in verse 53, but this is your hour and the power of darkness. And what he's saying is that there's a laced meaning in this, meaning it's dark for sure, but this is your darkness. This darkness is an evil darkness. Let's go to slide 6. I'm not about to cry. I'm trying to find my place. No. Yes. No. I've got stuff written all through my Bible, and my eyes don't function like they used to. At that hour, Jesus said to the crowds, have you come out against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I sat in the temple, and you did not seize me. But all of this has taken place that the scriptures and the prophets might be fulfilled. Then all the disciples left him. This is where I cry. This is where Jesus, from now on through this night, is alone. He is totally going to fight every bit of this alone. And the big story is he's going to go through this crucifixion. He's going to be put to death on the cross, and he's going to be alone. And 11 of these disciples are going to change. Something's going to change in their lives. After Jesus is resurrected and he comes back to the 11 disciples. They 11 other than John are martyred, are put to death. They were willing to live after seeing the resurrection, something from an apologetics standpoint about the reality of Christ should speak to you about that these people that were willing to run, afraid of the cross, afraid of the soldiers, something changed in their life where they were, Peter said, crucify me upside down. I don't deserve to be crucified like my Savior. Crucify me upside down. Something changed in their lives. It's a big, big point. But for us, as you go through the story, realize the place of Jesus and that he is alone.
Then they seized him and led him away, bringing him into the high priest's house. And Peter was following at a distance. And when they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat down among them. Then a servant girl, seeing him as he sat in the light, and looking closely at him, said, "This man also was with him." But denying it, he said, "Woman, I do not know him." And a little later, someone else saw him and said, "You also are one of them." But Peter said, "Man, I am not." And after an interval of about an hour, still another insisted, saying, "Certainly this man was also with him, for he too is a Galilean." But Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you are talking about." And immediately while he was speaking, still the rooster crowed. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter, and Peter remembered the saying of the Lord, how he had said to him, "Before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and wept bitterly.
All right. They seized him. He's in the Garden of Gethsemane, and they take him to the high priest's house. Let's go to slide 8. So the band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. First, they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. It was Caiaphas who had advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. There are 2 functioning high priests, and it's Annas and Caiaphas. We can go back to the scriptures. There's 2 functioning high priests. The role of the high priest, according to the Old Testament, would have always been descendants of Aaron. When Rome came in, Rome viewed that as a political position, and they said, yeah, no more, we don't care, we get to choose. We're going to choose the high priest. And so in 6 AD, Quirinius, how many of you have heard the name Quirinius? You've all heard the name Quirinius. It is go back and read the birth of Jesus. This was, Jesus is born when Quirinius is governor of Judea, of Syria. Somebody look that up. It's one of those 2. But so Quirinius in 6 AD appoints Annas. Roll forward to 15 AD, and Claudius Valerius fires him. And he puts in his son-in-law as chief priest. But the Hebrew people, knew that the high priest role was to function for life. And so they still regarded Annas as the high priest, and Caiaphas was also functioning as the high priest. And so they're both hauled into the house. They take him into the high priest's house. I'll show you a map in a minute that is close or indicative of where they were marching all this time. And so Peter and John are the only 2 of the 10. We've got one that has been a betrayer, and we have 2 that are following that aren't really willing to follow. Those were the ones, Peter and John also were the ones that weren't willing to pray when they needed to pray, so they're not prepared. And in verse 55, they've kindled a fire, and then it says a servant girl seeing him, and when it says servant girl, it's girl. It's not 20 years old. This is a young girl is there making the accusation. And there's a point that he's making here that Peter was not even willing to stand up. A woman in Hebrew society, Jesus changed it, but a woman in Hebrew society was looked down on. And a servant girl would have been doubly looked down on, and a young girl would have been triply look down on. And so this is the person that's making the first accusation. And this man was also with him, she said, but he denied it by saying, "Woman, I do not know him." By the way, when I call my wife woman, it's not good. I don't know why, but I'm like, Jesus used it. I mean, if Jesus used it, she's like, "You're not Jesus, but you're about to see him." And so, yes, ma'am. When he says deny, the word in Greek, deny, is the exact opposite of acknowledge. So when we hear the word deny, we have a little bit different understanding of the word deny. But he is saying, I totally reverse acknowledgement of this person. I do not know him. Woman, I don't know him. A little later, in verse 58, this is going to be right around 2 a.m. And we know this in the next verse. So at 2 a.m., someone else sees him, and he said, "You're also one of them." But Peter said, "Man, I am not." And after an interval about an hour, another insisted, saying, "Certainly, this man was also with him, for he too is Galilean." But Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you're talking about." And immediately, while he was speaking, the rooster crowed. When this last time that he says that he does not know what you're talking about, he actually calls down curses. Let's go to slide 11, Matthew 74. Then he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, "I do not know the man." And immediately the rooster crowed. And what he's saying is, at this point, Peter, when it says he was calling curses on himself, he's calling on God to curse him if he's telling a lie. He's calling on God to curse him. And you can see the next verse talking about, we don't need to read it, you're not supposed to call on God to curse you. You're not supposed to make oaths. But Peter is denying Christ in the most vehement way, the most offensive way, by calling down a curse from God on himself. And, oh, by the way, it says, because he too is Galilean. So they knew that they were Galilean. Most of you have heard me try to say, the Hebrew word for Messiah is Mashiach. Notice how I say, ah. So that is called a guttural vowel in Hebrew. And there are 5 guttural vowels. And so you know how I butcher Mashiach. I can't do it like the Hebrews. Well, in writings in the Mishnah, they talk about how the Galileans would butcher the gutturals. So we actually, us West Texas people, have something in common with Jesus Christ. We can't pronounce our gutturals. So that's just for free. And so let's go to slide 12. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And I want you to notice in that definition, looked at the Hebrew word, which I can't read from him, emblepo. It means that he looked with special interest, love, or concern. So he can see somehow he has moved into a window. He can see this denial, and he looks at Peter with this special, it's not like a father, I'm so disappointed. It's with love and interest and concern. And so it says he went out and wept bitterly, if we go back to verse 62. And this is exact. So I'm not going to weep bitterly, but this is what we should do when we hurt Jesus. When we do something to offend Christ, it should have an emotional impact on us. We should go to Christ. We should go to Christ, and we should weep. This isn't weep. This is being emotional, but it should hurt us when we sin. And so, as part of your prayer life, you need to make sure that you're asking God to reveal sins that you may not know, and you're supposed to be asking for forgiveness, and you're supposed to be emotional about it. All right. Hopefully. Oh, no. So let's go to the trials, slide 9. When I was in Boy Scouts, I learned what the term kangaroo court is. How many of you know what a kangaroo court is? The lawyer, of course. You've probably participated. Probably run one the whole time. So my son's a lawyer for you visitors. So a kangaroo court is a court with a predetermined outcome regardless of the facts. And so, in Boy Scouts, I was convicted of having wrinkles in my bed. And there were no wrinkles in my bed. It doesn't matter. I was convicted, and I was going, as a result of the conviction and the judgment and the decision, I was going to pay the price. A kangaroo court is a term that's used for Putin. Putin arrests people who are have beliefs antithetical to the Russian government, and he will put them on trial, and they will be convicted. And it doesn't matter what the facts are. They held a Wall Street Journal reporter for 2 years that was just released as part of a prisoner swap. And so these 6 cases, there were 3 religious cases, are kangaroo courts. And in particular, the religious cases are kangaroo courts. This first trial before Annas that we read about, he's, first of all, according to the Mishnah is the illicit rule, or not the illicit rules, the explicit rules that have been laid out in addition to the Torah or to the Bible, to the Hebrews that we don't believe, lay out what a proper trial is supposed to be. The high priest should not be involved in interrogation, according to the Mishnah. The high priest and no jury should be investigating anything in the dark of night. There shall be, for any capital trial, there has to be multiple witnesses. Jesus goes through this, as I just said, totally alone. And so these trials take place in what is a predetermined outcome, a total kangaroo court. First, he will go to Annas, and then Annas will take him to his son-in-law, Caiaphas, and then he'll be sent over to the Sanhedrin at daytime, and then eventually to Pilate and Herod, and I'll talk about them on the next slide. Let's go to the next slide, Brett. So this is hard for me to see. So on the right, you'll see the Garden of Gethsemane, and they traveled to where it is believed the high priest's house was. And so they would have traveled down through the Kidron Valley and over, you'll see number 1, which is the trial of Annas. Annas and Caiaphas, it's believed, probably lived in the same house in 2 different wings. The second trial would have been Caiaphas, and then they would have sent him to the temple, to the Sanhedrin. We'll see later exactly where the Sanhedrin is, and I'll tell you what the Sanhedrin means. And then they would have moved over to the fortress of Antonia, which is Pilate. Now, Pilate is interesting. Pilate, how many have been to Israel, to Caesarea Philippi? So Pilate would have been stationed at Caesarea Philippi, way further north and on the ocean. But because of all of the talk of the Messiah, because 2 million Jews are going to come into Jerusalem, he is there at this time to make sure that peace is kept and ordered. His job is to make sure there's no uprising, that everything runs according to proper order. He will decide that this guy's not guilty, and then he'll hear, oh, this guy, Jesus, is Galilean. Well, we should send him to Herod Antipas, because Herod Antipas is over the Galileans. He is the Syrian governor. So they send him to Herod's palace, Antipas. This is not Herod the Great. And he doesn't want to mess with him. He sends him back to Pilate. Ultimately, Pilate both times says, I find no fault in him. And they replace Barabbas with Jesus and crucify him. So let's close out, Sean.
Now the men who were holding Jesus in custody were mocking him as they beat him. They also blindfolded him and kept asking him, "Prophesy, who is it that struck you?" And they said many other things against him, blaspheming him.
When day came, the assembly of the elders, the people together, the chief priests, the scribes, and they led him away to their council. The Sanhedrin was in charge of civil and religious matters. If you go back to our study of Numbers, you'll remember that after Moses had received the law, he then began moving north to the Promised Land, and he's hearing all the cases of the people. And he says, it's just too much. And his father-in-law says to him, what you're doing is not wise. You need to appoint 70 men, and those 70 men need to help you govern. And so the Sanhedrin was 70 people plus the high priest. It had to be an odd number. There were also smaller Sanhedrins of 24 that were in the other areas. And so let's go to slide 17. And so at this point in time, when they go to the Sanhedrin, they have just crossed over into daytime. So they have now assembled. The Sanhedrin only assembled during the day. So he has gone through the cockcrow. He's being beaten by the high priest and their officers in their kangaroo court as they're putting covers over his eyes and then mocking him, saying, "Okay, prophesy. Who hit you? I mean, if you truly have the power of God, prophesy." And so now he begins the real trial, even though everything else has taken place in front of the Sanhedrin. Let's go to slide 18. So if you look in the bottom right, you'll see a schematic of the Temple Mount. This is not the entire Temple Mount, but this is the temple proper. And first on the bottom, you see this would have been facing east. The bottom is facing east is the woman's court, and you recall on the bottom right of the woman's court was the temple treasury. Upper section is where the men would have gone, and you'll see a little tiny red area, which is where the Sanhedrin would have met. The high priest would have sat in judgment. The accused would have stood before him. There was a clerk that would have been there to witness everything that was being said, and this is the trial that takes place. And so we can go back to slide 16. So when day comes, the assembly and the elders gathered together, both the chief priest and the scribes. So we know that part of the Sanhedrin was involved in the kangaroo court trials that had just taken place because they're using the term chief priest and scribes as part of the Sanhedrin, and they lead him away to the council, and they say, "If you are the Christ, tell us." And he says, "If I tell you, you will not believe." And this is Jack Nicholson saying, "You can't handle the truth. I know what this is. Even if I answer, you're not going to, if I ask you, you're not even going to answer. But now, from now on, the Son of Man shall be seated at the right hand of the power of God." Again, this is a messianic reference to the Son of God approaching the Ancient of Days and sitting at his right hand. And they're like, okay, so you're saying you're the Son of God? And unfortunately, the ESV has an awful translation of his answer. So let's go to slide 19. So slide 19. The reason I put this here, we've already covered this. This is from several chapters ago. Jesus has already laid out the fact that the Son of God is actually part of God, that he is the part of God. If you read it, it says, "But then he said to them, how can they say that Christ is David's son? For David himself says that in the book of Psalms, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. Thus David calls him Lord." And Luke is taking this, and Jesus is taking this from Psalm 110 that we talked about. You'll see David says the Lord, and that is all caps. And all caps, Lord is the tetragrammaton, which is Yahweh, which Yahweh means I am. And so this word in Greek, it is Yahweh says to Adonai, my Lord. And what he is saying is that David, as the king, his heir, he would never call his heir Lord, Adonai. Never would he do that. And yet David knew that the coming Messiah was going to sit at the right hand of God. And so Jesus is already saying that. Okay, so let's go to slide 20. Now, the proper translation, ESV messes this up and says that I am he, but the proper translation, Jesus said, ego eimi, I am. So when they ask him, are you the Son of God? He said to them, I am. And he's saying, I am God. I am. It's the same as Yahweh. That is the translation in Greek of the Hebrew term, the tetragrammaton, Yahweh. So let's go back to the scriptures. And so they realize it. People, it's a numbskull argument that says Jesus never said that he was Christ. He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man gets to the Father except by me. I am. I am the way. I am the truth. I am the life. There is one way. There's not many ways to God. He professed himself, held himself out to be the Son of God, and he answers this question directly. And they say, what further testimony do we need? We have heard it from his own lips, and he is. Any questions or comments? Yes, ma'am. So for those in Zoom land, Janine is saying she thought it was so neat that today the congregation celebrated the Lord's Supper knowing that we are in the midst of studying this, and how it becomes even more emotional when you go through that and you think of it in that context. All right, thank you all so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Russell.